Okay, so you sent over some really interesting stuff about how you're using Amazon S3,
Hmm.
specifically these directory buckets.
Right.
And we thought we would take a deep dive into this and really kind of unpack it for our
Mhm.
listeners.
Yeah, definitely.
So we're going to focus on the lifecycle management of the objects in those buckets.
Exactly.
And for folks who aren't as familiar with this idea of lifecycle management, can you give us a quick overview of what that even means in this context?
Yeah, so you're basically trying to automate how your data ages and how it's eventually like removed from your storage.
Yeah.
And this can be a huge help for managing your costs, right? You don't want to be paying for storage that you're not using anymore.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's also important for just good data hygiene, like making sure that you're not holding on to data longer than you need to.
Right, right.
And the documentation you sent over was really thorough.
Oh, yeah.
So our goal today is to sort of distill that down
Right.
into like the essential knowledge you need to understand,
Yeah.
and then actually implement lifecycle management for your own S3 directory buckets.
Yeah, so we're trying to streamline this for you so you can save time and potentially save money, too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of lifecycle management, I think it's worth talking about just like the initial step of getting your data into these directory buckets in the first place, right?
Sure.
The guide mentions this, so let's kind of walk through the basics of using the Amazon S3 console for that.
Sure. So yeah, this is like the on-ramp, getting your data into these buckets.
Right.
And the guide lays out a pretty simple way to do it.
Okay.
So first, you sign into your AWS Management Console, go to the S3 console, and then on the left-hand side, you'll see this, this list of things, and one of them is buckets.
Right.
And underneath that, there's actually a specific tab for directory buckets.
Okay, so you're drilling down into that specific section.
All right.
Right.
And you pick the bucket that you want to populate, and then you hit the import button.
Okay, makes sense. So you've hit import, now what? Like, where is S3 supposed to get this data from?
Right. So the next step is to specify the source, right?
Right.
So this is where you tell S3 where the objects that you want to move are currently located.
Okay.
And this could be like another general purpose S3 bucket,
Mm,
or even just a specific path within a bucket.
gotcha.
The console is actually pretty nice. You can actually browse through your existing buckets and stuff, so it's pretty handy.
That's nice.
Yeah. And then one of the interesting things here is how it handles permissions.
Oh, yeah, the all-important permissions, right? Like, who can access what?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So for granting permission to access and copy those source objects, the guide outlines 3 different methods,
Okay.
and these are all centered around IAM roles.
Right.
Now, for those who don't know, IAM roles are basically a way to grant very specific permissions to different services or users within an AWS.
Right, right.
So the first option is to have S3 just automatically create a brand new IAM role just for this import task.
Oh.
And the second option is if you already have a suitable role configured,
Yeah.
you can just select it from a list of your existing IAM roles.
Okay. That's convenient.
Right. And for people who are really comfortable with IAM and they know exactly what they're doing, the third option is you can directly enter the ARN, which is the Amazon resource name, which is basically just a unique identifier for any resource within AWS.
Right, right.
So you can directly enter the ARN of an existing IAM role that you want to use.
So it gives you kind of a range of options depending on your level of, I guess, comfort
Yeah.
with IAM.
Yeah, exactly.
Or your existing setup.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay, so we've pointed S3 at our data. We've told it who has permission to move it, what happens next.
So then you get to review the destination,
Okay.
which should be the directory bucket that you picked in the first place, right?
Right.
And then you also look over the copied object settings,
Okay.
make sure everything looks good, and then you just hit import,
Okay.
and that kicks off the data transfer.
Awesome. And the guide mentions that you can monitor the progress of this job on the batch operations page.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah, and that page will give you like detailed information and even a direct link to your destination bucket once it's all done.
Perfect. Okay, so that gets our data into these, the fast lane, I guess we would call it, of directory buckets.
Right, yeah.
But now we have to make sure we're not paying for that high-performance storage longer than we actually need it.
Right.
And that brings us to the heart of what we're talking about today, which is managing that data over time with S3 Lifecycle for directory buckets.
Exactly.
So what is the fundamental idea behind S3 Lifecycle?
So as your guide says, the main goal is to help you efficiently manage your storage costs in S3 Express One Zone.
Okay.
And you do that by automatically deleting objects that have expired.
Right. So things that are no longer needed.
Exactly. Things you don't need anymore. Get rid of them, save some money.
Yeah.
It's basically like setting up an automated data retention policy.
So it's like putting certain data on a timer.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So how do we go about actually like defining these rules for our directory buckets?
Okay, so you do this by creating what's called an S3 lifecycle configuration.
Okay.
And this is specific to each bucket, right? So
Yeah.
each directory bucket will have its own lifecycle configuration.
Gotcha.
And you can think of this configuration as like a container that holds a bunch of rules.
Okay.
And the guide mentions you can use different tools to create these configurations. You can use the AWS command line interface, which is often called the CLI.
Right.
You can use the AWS SDKs, which are like the software development kits. You can even use the Amazon S3 REST API directly.
Yeah.
Or if you're into infrastructure as code, you can even use AWS CloudFormation to do it.
So lots of options there depending on
Yeah.
how you like to manage your infrastructure.
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so these rules that we're putting inside the configuration, what are they actually telling S3 to do? Like what actions can we define here?
So the rules are where you specify the actions that you want S3 to take on certain objects.
Okay.
And for directory buckets, the guide highlights two main actions that you can automate. One is expiring objects based on their age. So basically how long they've been sitting in your bucket.
Right. So like after 30 days, delete this thing.
Yeah, exactly. You got it.
Okay.
And the second one is deleting incomplete multi-part uploads.
Oh, that's interesting.
And this happens daily.
Okay. So like if somebody started uploading a large file and it just, for whatever reason, didn't complete, we can get rid of that partial upload.
Exactly. You don't want to be paying to store those unfinished uploads.
Right. Makes sense.
So it's all about keeping things clean and efficient.
Now, does this life cycle management only apply to new data that we upload from this point forward, or does it also take into account what's already in the bucket?
It applies to both.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, the guide makes that super clear.
Okay.
So when you apply a lifecycle configuration to a bucket, S3 immediately starts looking at all the objects, both the ones that are already there and any new ones that come in.
Okay.
So let's say you create a rule that says any object with a certain prefix should expire after 30 days. S3 will immediately scan your existing objects, find any that have that prefix and are older than 30 days, and then queue them up for deletion.
So it's not just a forward-looking policy. It actually applies retroactively.
Right, which is a really important thing to be aware of.
Yeah, you could definitely catch someone off guard if they're not expecting that.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the guide also mentions a key difference in how Lifecycle works for directory buckets compared to those more general-purpose S3 buckets. What's the most important thing to understand there?
Okay, so here's the key difference. While you can expire objects and delete those incomplete uploads, S3 Lifecycle doesn't support transitions between storage classes for directory buckets.
Oh, interesting.
So with a standard S3 bucket, you might have a rule that says, if this data hasn't been accessed in a while, move it to a cheaper storage tier.
Right, like Glacier or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. But that functionality isn't there for directory buckets.
Right.
It's all about speed and low latency.
Right. It's that S3 Express 1 zone. It's designed for that high performance.
Exactly. So lifecycle management is mostly about expiring data, not so much about moving it between tiers.
Okay, that makes sense in that context.
Yep.
All right, so when S3 Lifecycle is doing its thing and deleting these expired objects, how does that actually happen? What's the mechanism?
So S3 Lifecycle uses the delete object and delete objects API operations to actually remove those objects.
Okay.
But here's a really important detail. To do this in a directory bucket, S3 Lifecycle uses the create session API to get temporary security credentials.
Oh, interesting.
So it's kind of like, even though it has permission to access the bucket, it needs to ask for a temporary badge to actually go in and delete something.
So it's like a more controlled session-based approach.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that makes sense.
And the guide also highlights the role of bucket policies here.
Right, bucket policies, those are always important.
Super important.
So if you have a bucket policy that denies delete permissions to the lifecycle principal,
Right.
which is the thing acting on behalf of S3 Lifecycle,
Yeah.
it will actually prevent it from deleting anything.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Even if you have the lifecycle rules perfectly configured.
So that's something you really want to double check for.
Yeah, definitely. You want to make sure your bucket policies are set up to let S3 Lifecycle do its job.
And the guide even provides an example of a bucket policy that we can look at.
Mm-hmm.
Can you kind of break down the key elements of that for us?
Yeah, so this policy is designed to let the lifecycle.s3.amazonoz.com service principal, which is basically the name for S3 Lifecycle.
Hmm.
It lets it call the S3 Express create session API,
Okay.
so it can get those temporary credentials.
Right, with the read-write session mode.
Exactly.
Okay.
So let's look at the parts of the policy. The effect is set to allow, which means we're granting permission.
Makes sense.
Then the principal is service, lifecycle.s3.amazonoz.com.
Okay.
So that's who we're giving the permission to.
Right, the specific service principle.
And the action is 3 express create session.
Okay.
So that's the API call they're allowed to make.
Right, to get those temporary credentials.
Exactly.
Got it.
Then there's a condition.
Okay.
And this one says that the session mode has to be read-write.
Okay, so it's restricting it to that specific mode.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, the resource specifies which bucket this policy applies to.
Oh.
And they give you an example, ARN, which is arn.as3express.us.us.2.4123456789211.buckettamsien-s3 demo bucket use 2 as 2 xs3.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is.
Okay.
But the important thing to remember is that this ARN is very specific to the example bucket.
Right.
It's in a specific region, it has a specific name, all that.
So you can't just copy and paste this into your own setup.
No, you absolutely need to replace this with the ARN of your own directory bucket.
Right, you got to tailor it to your specific needs.
Exactly.
Okay, good to know.
And you'll find that ARN in the S3 console for your bucket.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So once we have our lifecycle rules set up, and hopefully our bucket policies are all configured correctly, how do we actually monitor what's happening? Like, how do we know if our rules are being applied the way we expect them to be?
So for any actions that happen on objects in your directory buckets, including the ones taken by S3 Lifecycle, AWS CloudTrail actually generates logs.
Oh.
So you get management event logs and data event logs.
Right.
So if you want to see when your rules are deleting objects, you can look in those CloudTrail logs.
Right.
And the guide actually points you to a section on CloudTrail log file examples for S3 Express 1 zone, which will give you some more details on what to look for.
So it's like a deeper dive into the logs themselves.
Exactly.
Okay, so CloudTrail is our friend here for monitoring all of this.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, now let's talk about the actual steps of creating and managing these lifecycle configurations.
Okay.
We talked about using the AWS CLI, we talked about the SDKs, but the guides spend a bit of time focusing on using the CLI, so let's start there. What are the essential things to know about managing lifecycle rules from the command line?
So the guide highlights 3 main CLI commands you'll be using.
Okay.
The first is put bucket lifecycle configuration.
Okay.
And this one is used to either create a new configuration or update an existing one.
Okay, so it's like the main command for putting that configuration in place.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Then there's get bucket lifecycle configuration.
Yeah.
And as you might guess, that one lets you retrieve the current lifecycle configuration.
So you can see what's already there.
Exactly, you can view it.
Right.
And then the last one is delete bucket lifecycle.
Okay.
And that one removes the entire lifecycle configuration from the bucket.
So if you want to start from scratch.
Yeah, if you want to clear it all out.
Gotcha.
And the guide also reminds us that while lifecycle configurations are based on XML,
Right.
when you're using the CLI, you actually need to provide them in JSON format.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a quirk.
Okay, so JSON, it is for the CLI.
Exactly. And they actually give us an example of a lifecycle configuration policy written in JSON.
Oh, cool.
So we can kind of break that down.
Yeah, let's take a look at what this example rule is doing.
Okay, so this one is pretty simple. It defines a single rule, and it gives it an ID of lifecycle expiration rule.
Okay.
And it's enabled, so it's active.
Gotcha.
The important part is the filter.
Okay.
This rule uses an AND condition, meaning all the criteria have to be met for the rule to apply to an object.
Okay.
So the criteria here are a prefix of my prefix.
Okay.
So it only looks at objects that start with that prefix.
Right.
It also has conditions based on the object size.
Okay.
So the object has to be greater than 500 bytes and less than 64,000 bytes.
So it's targeting a very specific size range.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then finally, it defines an expiration action with days.
Okay, so after 7 days, poof, it's gone.
Yeah, if it meets all those criteria, it's out of there.
So it's a very targeted rule.
Right.
Focused on objects with a certain prefix and size, and then it expires them after a week.
Yeah.
Cool. And the guide even gives us the actual CLI command that we would use to apply this policy.
Yeah, they do.
Can you walk us through that real quick?
Sure. So the example command is oz3pi put bucket lifecycle configuration region uswest2 profile default bucket msns3 demo bucket usw2 asas1 xs3 lifecycle configuration file .lc-policy.json checksum-algorithm CRC32C.
Okay, a lot going
Yeah,
on.
there's a few parts to it,
Okay,
but the key thing is you'll need to replace those placeholders with your actual info.
right,
So you need the right AWS region, your profile if you're using one,
right.
and most importantly, the actual name of your bucket.
Instead of that placeholder bucket name.
Exactly.
Okay.
The lifecycle-configuration file .lc-policy.json part tells the CLI to read the policy from a file you create,
Okay.
which you would call lc-policy.json.
Right.
And that file would have the JSON configuration that we just talked about.
Okay, makes sense.
And then the last bit, checksum-algorithm CRC32C, that's optional.
Okay.
It helps ensure that the data is transferred correctly.
Oh, cool. So it's like a data integrity check.
Exactly.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So basically, you define your rule in JSON, save it to a file, and then use the CLI command, making sure to update it with your specific bucket details.
Exactly.
And that pushes it up to S3.
Yeah, and then S3 takes it from there.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Now, the guide also shows us what this looks like in XML format.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just for us to kind of understand the structure, even though we're using JSON with the CLI?
Right. It's mostly just for conceptual understanding.
Oh,
like
yeah.
if you're working with the S3 API directly, or you see it represented in XML somewhere else.
Okay.
It's good to know how it's structured, but for the CLI, you'll be using JSON.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
What about using the SDKs?
So the guide includes some code examples in a few popular languages like Java, Go, .NET, and Python.
Okay.
And this shows you how you can interact with lifecycle configurations programmatically.
So if you're more comfortable working in code?
Right, and these SDKs make it really easy because they handle all those low-level API calls for you. Okay. So you can manage lifecycle rules right within your applications or your scripts.
That gives you a lot of flexibility.
Exactly.
Okay. So whether you prefer the command line or working with code, AWS has got you covered.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Now, I think it's worth addressing a common problem that somebody might run into,
Okay.
which is, they've set up their lifecycle configuration, but the objects in their directory bucket aren't expiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that happens.
What are some of the key things to check if you're troubleshooting this kind of issue?
First thing, and this is super important, make sure you've granted that create session permission to the lifecycle service principal in your bucket policy.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah, and also make sure that it has permission to actually delete objects.
Right. So both of those permissions are crucial.
Absolutely. If either of those is missing, S3 Lifecycle won't be able to do anything.
So that's the first thing to check.
Yes. And the guide also recommends looking in your CloudTrail logs for any access denied errors related to create session. If you see those, it's a pretty good sign that there's a problem with your bucket policy.
Gotcha.
Now, if your policies look good, then the next step is to check the lifecycle rules themselves.
Okay.
Make sure the filters are targeting the right objects.
Right. So double check those prefixes, object sizes, and any other criteria you've defined.
Exactly. You want to make sure the rules are actually applying to the objects you want them to.
Right. And we also mentioned that we can use CloudTrail logs to monitor what the lifecycle rules are actually doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that can be helpful too.
Yeah, it can help you figure out if a rule is being applied to the wrong objects.
Right. So it's a process of checking permissions
Yeah.
and then the logic of your rules.
Exactly. Systematic troubleshooting.
Right. And finally, the guide touches on using batch operations with directory buckets.
Yeah.
How does that fit into this whole picture of managing data?
So batch operations is a really powerful tool for performing actions on a lot of objects at once.
Okay.
And for S3 Express One Zone, it supports a couple of key actions. One is copy. So you can copy objects between directory buckets or between general purpose buckets and directory buckets.
Okay, so it gives you some flexibility in moving data around.
Right.
Right.
And the other one is invoke AWS Lambda function.
Oh, interesting.
So you can actually run your own custom code on the objects in your directory bucket.
So that opens up a lot of possibilities.
Definitely.
Okay.
So while batch operations isn't directly involved in expiring objects, it can be really helpful for other data management tasks.
Right, so it's kind of like a complementary tool.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So we've covered a lot of ground today.
Yeah, we have.
Let's wrap things up with some key takeaways for our listeners.
Okay.
So first and foremost, you should now have a good understanding of how to manage the life cycle of objects in S3 directory buckets, with a focus on automatic expiration and handling those incomplete multi-part uploads.
Right. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to set up those bucket policies correctly.
Absolutely. You got to make sure that create session permission is there.
And the delete permissions too.
Right. Those are essential for everything to work.
Exactly.
We also talked about all the different tools you have available,
Yeah.
the CLI and the SDKs, which give you a lot of flexibility in how you manage these configurations.
Yeah, you can pick the tool that works best for you.
And we also encourage you to dig into the AWS documentation on CloudTrail logs.
Yeah, those logs are really valuable for monitoring and troubleshooting.
All right, so as a final thought for our listeners to consider,
Okay.
given the speed and the cost of S3 Express One Zone,
Hmm.
how can you strategically use lifecycle policies to really make the most of this high-performance storage,
That's a great question.
right? Like, how can you optimize it for your most frequently accessed data while also ensuring that it's removed when it's no longer needed,
Yeah, it's all about striking that balance.
right? Performance, cost, and smart data management.
Exactly.
All right, thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Yeah, this was fun.